Hello, my name is Donaldas and this is a Right Mind podcast, a podcast produced by the Institute of European Rights. In today's episode, we will talk about the state of Putin's court, Russia's internal dynamics, changes in Russia's MODs, and all the other matters that are connected with these things, and of course, with the Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. Our guest for today is Dr. Donaldu Jensen, who is a senior advisor for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He writes extensively on Russian domestic, foreign, and security policies. As a former diplomat, he played a role in the final years of the Cold War, contributing to landmark treaties such as START, INF, and SDI. His first-hand experience during his tenure at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in 1991 allowed him to witness the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Mr. Jensen, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. I would like to start by asking about your experience in the late Cold War years. I'm personally very interested in those years, especially in the drafting and the negotiations of the treaties of START, INF, SDI. What was your role in those years in U.S. administration?
Well, I had one of those careers that was extremely lucky when I was young in the first 10 years, and it was calmer later. So I joined the State Department in 1985, the same year, actually a month before Gorbachev was selected General Secretary of the Soviet Union. So from that time onward, meaning that really the next decade, I was involved in one way or the other on Russia-U.S., Soviet-U.S. Issues. First on arms control, and I was a staffer for the strategic arms negotiations, which had three parts: INF, which were not strategic, so-called Star Wars, and then the strategic arms direct bilateral discussions. And I was a staffer. I was in Washington fielding questions about what the Russian position would be, how do I explain this issue, that issue. And it's very interesting and very helpful today because you see that the sides interpret the same language differently sometimes. And you really have to have a background in the culture, the language, and the area, the issue, to connect in order to get some kind of an agreement. After the treaty was signed for INF in early 1988, as I recall, I was then a missile inspector, which was verifying the number of missiles the Soviets had, supervising some of the destruction. And again, the same issues come up. Why did it work? What strategies does the West use to make the Soviets cooperate? But also even sitting at a table for 9 hours in one case, arguing about the meaning of one single Russian word in terms of the memorandum we had to sign to approve a missile base being closed. It's very, very instructive. In fact, as you know, I'm finishing up a paper at USIP on how to negotiate with the Russians. And it's even more complicated now. But that was number two. Third and fourth were again, incredibly lucky chance to be there in 91 during the coup and the end of the Soviet Union. And then in 93, fortunate but not lucky in the sense that tragic shootout on the streets of Moscow. And so as I look at Putin today, as we talk about, as we do in Washington, the future of I keep saying Soviet, the Putinist regime, you always replay in your head, at least I do, what happened between 1989, including Lithuania, and then subsequent years. What's different? What's not different? What did we get wrong? What did we get right? And there are lessons to be had.
And how do you remember those years from 1988 till basically 1993? What were the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia were in your view?
Well, I would, again, this is my personal opinion.
Yes.
This is not that of USIP or anybody else.
Yeah.
I would start the clock really with Gorbachev's election and then watch him try to reform the system. The intense debate about whether the Soviet Union was reformable, and then the rise of Boris Yeltsin as a challenger to Gorbachev. And what that would mean for the future, first of the USSR, second for security in Europe, and third for the prospects for democratic change in Russia. And those things are coming back to bite us, as they say now. And I think that some of the lessons we might have drawn have not been drawn clearly enough or effectively enough. In particular, if I might add,
yes, please.
I think we, meaning the U.S. in general, U.S. Russia watchers in general, misinterpreted the 1991 events as a breakthrough for democracy. And looking back, I don't think that was the case at all. That was the era of Fukuyama, the end of history, that kind of thing. And we saw essentially, in a general sense, we saw what happened in 91 as a repetition, another stage of what happened here in Lithuania over the previous 2 years, where there was a democratic breakthrough. And so I think, to some extent, I could use my Jesuit training, that was, in a sense, one of the original sins of the Western reaction in the 90s and later to the fall of the Soviet Union, because it was not as simple as it seemed. It was certainly not a democratic breakthrough. The Soviet Union fell apart. I didn't say collapse, fell apart, leading to something else. And we always thought, again, I'm speaking in the general, we always thought that would more or less end in a democratic, pluralistic Russia. It didn't, for reasons that are worth studying and talking about. And we thus saw and made policy based on a premise that what happened under late Yeltsinism and now Putin was a departure from a democratic 90s, and that was not exactly what happened. And thus, the lessons that the Russian people take about the 90s now, chaos, exploitation by the West, are not true. But it's important to remember that the Russian people, saw what happened quite a bit differently than we did. And I can tell you that in those exciting days of the early 90s when shock therapy in Moscow and so forth, I would ask people, will this work the way it did in Poland and Lithuania? And the answer was, yes, these are the right policies, and they would. But they didn't. And so I think we need to think back on what happened, because there are fewer better examples of the use of the history lessons we can get from those events than for today. And I think they're very appropriate. So that becomes, for me, an early point of reference for what's going on in Russia now. And that helps a lot.
I remember just a couple of weeks ago, there were a video shared in Twitter, Richard Nixon's video of 1993, I believe, where in the interview, Richard Nixon, the former president, of course, is speaking about that contemporary Russia, about Russia of 1993, and he says quite explicitly that indeed communism has been destroyed, but the Russian nationalism and both imperialism wasn't, and that is a huge challenge and a future challenge for U.S. policy and for Western policy. And I believe he was one of the lone voices at that time.
Definitely. In fact, he visited Moscow at the time. I think I worked on the visit, in fact. And he was very astute on foreign policy in many ways. And you see that now because people confuse imperialism with communism. You can be as a Russian official, Chubais said some years ago, democratic empire. That's possible theoretically. Yeah, and Nixon was right. And in fact, there were continuities with the Soviet system and communism, as well as, let's call it the inherited traditional Russian strategic culture of seeing enemies outside, of expansionism, of seeing the smaller countries in East and Central Europe as not colonies, but almost. And those ways, habits of thinking about the world are not fully communist at all. And I would bring it to Putin because I think that it's a grave mistake to think that Putin is trying to recreate the USSR. I don't think that he is. In fact, he has several times really trashed Lenin, trashed the Bolsheviks and so forth. Putin is trying to recreate the Russian Empire which is which has continuities with the Soviet past, but also has continuities with the Tsarist distant past. And that's very troubling because it means getting rid of that mentality will be much harder. And if you look around at other empires, France, England, Britain, elsewhere, Ottoman Empire, these countries did not pull back easily and without trauma. And I think that's one thing we're going through now with Russia.
I remember reading the Simon Sebag's Montefiore's book about the Romanovs, the ruling dynasty of Russian Empire, and in his conclusion, Montefiore says that the two worst people for Vladimir Putin in Russian history are, first of all, Nicholas II, because he lost the empire. He of course, he lost the war and he lost the empire and he was executed, as we know. And the other person is Gorbachev, of course, because he too lost the empire. Yeah. And that are the two people that Putin is always looking into, and how not to repeat these mistakes in his head, not to lose the empire or, of course, expand the empire.
Yeah, and you see, if I can add to that thought,
please.
One of the phenomena of the Putin era is the re-emergence of the intelligence services as a key player in the system. And that's a big difference from the 90s. But Putin, as you say, in many ways, harkens back to an earlier Russian past that he's invented. And it's a regime that looks backward, not forward, because it really has no viable ideology to look forward. And so you see nonsense such as his version of Ukrainian and Russian history, which is completely fantasy and made up.
Absolutely.
But there are not a lot of countries where a regime tries to forge a usable past in the way that Putin has. It has the power to back it up. In the Balkans, you see evidence of that too as well. But a country like Lithuania, if I can make a comparison, looks forward and has come a long way, and it's a very hopeful, in many ways positive role in the world, and that's simply not what Russia wants for now.
Coming back to the treaties that you worked with in the late Cold War years, START, INF, SDI, in your view, how significant were these treaties, and what are their historical record?
Oh, well, I think they're very now. You can look at the strategic big picture and the individual picture. The big picture is that, of course, over a period of, let's say, 50 years, the USSR and then the Russian Federation and the West, the United States in particular, formed the rules for conducting many aspects of international security policy. There were rules that were understood and informal. The issue of deterrence, the issue of other dimensions of this competition, it was regulated to some extent. And because the USSR was as old as it was, run by old guys, they had remembered the war and how devastating it was, and they remembered how important it was to come to understandings about how conflicts should be managed. And it largely, not always, but it largely succeeded. So I think those rules, which are now breaking down in the competition among China, Russia, and the West and the United States in particular, that is really a major contribution that kept the peace for 50 years. The second level is the more micro level on nuclear arms. And I think what happened over that period of 50 years is that the sides developed mechanisms for regulating nuclear competition, particularly in the area of verification. In fact, one reason why the INF succeeded for a long time was that on-site inspections were allowed. We could inspect their missiles, and I did, and they could inspect ours here. And that was called a confidence building measure, CBM. And that is a very important contribution to international security. Other aspects as well, defining really technical questions that probably would bore your audience. How do you count a nuclear bomb on a bomber aircraft versus a missile? How do you relate those? And a lot of the work I did was coming to a conceptual understanding of how these things translated on each side, given our differing understandings of all that. Now, that's all breaking down now, and the United States has repeatedly expressed interest in negotiating a follow-on strategic arms treaty. And the Russians say, yes, but, and the but is we need to solve all the other problems in the relationship before we go on this. The U.S. has a different approach. We want to deal with strategic arms and agree to disagree on other things. And that so far is not something we've solved. And this is a time when new weapon systems are being developed, when China is becoming more aggressive. So it's more important even than it was 30 or 40 years ago, I think.
But you would agree that back in the day, back in the late 80s, there were a lot more trust between Washington and Moscow than it is now.
Well, I would quote the great President Ronald Reagan, trust but verify.
Yes.
These things, it's not, as the Russians would say, it's not a coincidence that these things happened when you had technical means of verifying what each side had. And still, they felt the need to inspect. And we would count missiles, and we would see where they were deployed and see if that corresponded accurately to the treaty, the treaty that had been approved. You need that because both sides ultimately don't trust each other. But you can make progress with, I was going to say goodwill on both sides toward getting a common objective. And that's all gone now, and it's all gone largely because of Putin's approach and Putin's view of the world, which is becoming more destructive.
Yeah. And so now moving into the contemporary matters and the as I've described in the start of a program that we will talk about the domestic politics in Russia in the current day. My question is sort of rather metaphorical. How one should look at the things that are happening in Russia? I mean, what words should one use? Is it a court? Is it a clan, a mafia, a cartel, or a prison, or all the things
or a
together?
Mafia state, or whatever.
Yeah,
I don't want to give the Russians too much credit. Why don't we just look at it as Russia with a combination of inheritances? One is the Tsarist inheritance, authoritarianism, patrimonialism, which my old professor at Harvard would call the blending of power and money, authoritarianism, the tendency to see enemies abroad, an imperial mindset. And then there is the Bolshevik inheritance, which is secrecy, conspiracy, lack of transparency, the control of the state by a very closed elite. And that's what we see right now. So why don't we just look at it as a distinctively Russian authoritarian, but not yet totalitarian, but going there, state, and not worry about a name of describer. But what's important is to understand the various processes that are going on. Because if you talk about it, a democratic future or not, that to me oversimplifies what's likely to happen. And I mentioned patrimonialism, which is the power of the blend, of money and political power. In the West, in Lithuania, that is considered corruption.
Yeah.
But in Russia, it's not considered corruption really. It's considered a tool of governing. So if you disagree with Moscow on such a fundamental issue, how can you expect Moscow to play by the rules of a Western democracy like Lithuania? You can't. So we here in the West, always have a tendency to mirror image our own experiences. Putin calls them political parties. We have them too, but they're not even this close to the same thing. Political party in Russia is much more like the Communist Party in nomenclatura than it is Social Democratic Party in the West. So worry less about the labels, I would say, and worry more about understanding these complicated, sometimes contradictory processes going on. Now, Putin that's expressly the policy of the Kremlin to overthrow the world order. And so I would take it at his word. And you can say, what does he want to replace it with? And there are a lot of good articles on that. You can also say that he likes chaos for its own sake, which weakens the West. So I would worry more about understanding those processes than having a label. But there's nothing wrong with having a label either. But it's very important to understand and not mirror image our own experiences, our own history, our own culture.
But where one should look inside Russia in order to understand these processes? I mean, what are the main interest groups, sort of, in a wide sense?
Excellent question.
Please.
You could divide them, Moscow and the regions, or within Moscow. Let's just list some. One would be the armed forces. Well, putting Putin aside, one would be the military, one would be the intelligence services, one would be the presidential administration and central bureaucracy, and one would be the regions. And historically, I mean, since 91, the city of Moscow, first under Mayor Lushkov and then under Mayor Sobyanin now, is an independent, somewhat independent Moscow from the Kremlin player. That is actually a political force. The intelligence services now are much stronger than they were 20 years ago. A very central, I would say the central player. The presidential administration does a lot of administrative stuff, almost by analogy to the old secretariat of the Communist Party. And of course, Putin above it. But a new emergent series of players are the, you never know what to call them, the clans, the political, economic, financial interest groups that have access to Putin. They have access to big business. They have access to regime money and have other aspects. These are called clans or interest. We used to call them financial industrial groups. And that is a major, unique development since 91. First under Yeltsin, now in a slightly different form under Putin. But those players, and there are about 15 or 20 of them, but really 5 or 6 core ones. Those players, let's call it, those clans, are central interest groups for lobbying what they want and for getting policy adopted. Now, you might say, and many people do, so what? But when you look at the military shakeup last month, in April and May, if you look at that, you can look at it as a cleaning up of corruption, or you could look at it as a punishment of former Defense Minister Shoigu, but you can also look at it as an attempt by Putin to balance the competing clans that play a major role in national politics, to make sure that they all have money, they all have power, they all are balanced in some way. And I think that's more important than some of the other explanations as well, because Putin's power is not unlimited. That makes him not yet a totalitarian leader. Putin's power is constrained by certain factors. I don't want to sound like a Bolshevik, I won't say objective factor, but it's constrained by certain factors, one of which is that he needs to make sure, even as he's the boss, he needs to make sure that individual clan groups have the assets they need to be satisfied and balanced. He needs to ensure that when he prosecutes the war in Ukraine, that he doesn't go beyond a red line, perhaps mobilizing officially the population, drafting more, hundreds of thousands more soldiers they need if they want to win this war. So those are the players, and I think it's important to remember that those players are not always important on every issue. If it's agriculture, it's one group. If it's the war in Ukraine, it's another group. And they're always in competing with each other. They ebb and flow. They have informal relationships with each other. And it's important to be not a Westerner when looking at them, because the formal hierarchy of bureaucratic agencies that you'd see in the United States or Lithuania, that doesn't necessarily reflect the power of individual players or individual groupings. So what you end up having is a very personalized set of relationships. You have a cross-cutting allegiances. A major industrialist, Chemezov, for example, would have a set of political ties that doesn't necessarily correspond to his formal rank or former responsibilities as head of Rostec. So that always has to be kept in mind. And trust me, it takes a lot of work to follow this. But if you want to understand how Russia is ruled, that I think is what you have to focus on, that kind of thing.
Are these groups generally satisfied about the war and what happened in Russia since the February 2022?
I would say largely yes, unfortunately, from what I can see. There are those once in a while whose head pops up and they usually say, we don't like the way the war is being conducted. And then they pop down again. Because
whatever
as
that
you see, good for them, smart guys. Yeah. So I think that in general the war is supported. What you see, though, in a bad sense, is that Putin is now putting the whole system that he built on a war footing where the war becomes the raison d'etre of the system. And so if you make continuation of the war the central goal of the society, it makes obviously negotiations or ceasefire or anything like that very difficult to achieve. There is a very smart Russian analyst named Yekaterina Shulman who wrote an article a couple weeks ago about how staying in power is the central goal of Putin and his team. And indeed, that may be the case. And she said, well, if they wanted to wind down the war and stay in power, they would. And that's a very interesting idea. Very different from the probably more prominent view that Putin's ideology that he talks about, Putin's putting the country on a war footing, is the central raison d'etre of the system. I'm not sure one or the other. It's more likely both. So I would not expect any open dissent on the war. If there was any dissent, and I'm sure a lot of people are concerned or afraid, you don't see it. And that means it's probably there. Don't think it doesn't exist, but so far not effective enough to make a difference. So what you see then by comparison to the Yeltsin uprising is you see no emergence of an alternative leader. You see no popular support for an alternative leader like Yeltsin in the late 80s. And you have to keep in mind that the Russian people voted to secede from the Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation became legally a more autonomous player because of Yeltsin's leadership. It was Russian nationalism interpreted as a constructive force. That's not here now. People are quiet. There's no alternative leader. And when somebody gets the head above the trenches, things happen. And something happened to Prigozhin. I don't know who did it or ordered it, but that's a good example. And 20 years ago, a general named Alexander Lebed, a very charismatic general who had helped Yeltsin during the putsch, died in a strange plane crash. The regime, whoever, I don't know who did those things, but the regime is not comfortable with alternative possibilities, I would say, especially from the military. And I am told that if you go down the streets of Moscow, the war hero placards on the walls are never of generals. They're always of captains and corporals and lieutenants, because anybody above that could be a danger to the regime.
They don't want another Zhukov. Right. Coming back to the changes in Russia's MOD, recent changes. Generally, when we see the pyramid of power in Russia, generally it is rather a stable structure. I mean, we see those people who are there for many years. Lavrov, Shoigu, of course, before a couple of months, Patrushevs, Narishkins, Peskovs, and all the others. And suddenly, without any indication, suddenly Shoigu is being replaced. What does that mean?
Well, it means Putin is confident with loyalty over competence. It means that if you shake it up too much, you risk the system. We risk undermining the system. And I think another actor active here quietly are the intelligence services, which are in a bureaucratic, more or less constant rivalry with the MOD. And a lot of I would argue that some of the changes are not about competence or even loyalty. They're about a competition between the FSB. I don't know. I'm just going what I read. The FSB and the MOD on money and power, and those, especially security-related firms like Rostec, Rosatom, have an incredible amount of money and access. And their ties are both to the presidential administration and the military. And you can't judge something like the shakeup just on the grounds of they're punishing Shoigu. I mean, it's a more complicated process than that. And, this is still sort of going on, and there are anomalies. Why did they arrest Gerasimov's deputy, but not Gerasimov? Why did they arrest two of the generals who have a good reputation and not others? Who did they pick out and why? Those are questions we'll never know, but the unpredictability of it means that something more is going on than just punishing Shoigu. Although certainly by reputation, he's very corrupt. So there's all that going on. And so Shoigu has his own clan, and others in other parts of the government do too. And Shoigu was known to grab a lot of money, allegedly. Shoigu was known to have a big network. And maybe even Putin finally decided the system has tilted too much in one direction. Let's even things out a little bit. And in addition, throw in possible succession candidates. As we've seen, we're now going to the sons and daughters of prominent Russians in positions for which they are far underqualified. Patrushev's son is talked about a lot. So to me, that indicates a desire for new blood, as Putin understandably might want. It also it's a transferring the succession, the system into a more intergenerational thing, which to me indicates Putin wants to preserve and solidify and consolidate the system he has built. You talked about his second cousin, his niece. I can't even keep track of them. Patrushev's son. All these people are in their 40s, and you see that group plus other interesting characters like Juman, who's in his 40s, who was a former bodyguard, governor of Tula, and now presidential aide. You see guys like that who now play more influential roles, or I think will try to. And that indicates a generational shift as well in leadership. To what end, I don't know, because it's one thing to have a job in Russia, it's another thing to know how to function within it, which often is unrelated to your job. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. But one more point on this, though, is that in the military-industrial complex in particular, and we know that the Russians have a pretty bad Russian system has a pretty bad record of supplying troops and money, the weapons the army needs for this horrible war in Ukraine. You see 3 or 4 people positioned to have a role in that. The new defense minister, Belousov, of course, but also Juman and Mantura, others who seem to have a claim on that sector. That means there's going to be chaos if somebody doesn't emerge as the boss. Now, Belousov is, by all accounts, a relatively independent figure, and he's, by all accounts, and I don't know, a good manager, but that means that in order to clean up the defense ministry, he's got to have somebody's support, meaning Putin, and it's not clear that he can do that over against these competitors, which means that it's likely to be a slow process if it works at all, 3 or 4 or 5 years. So we'll have to see.
And the other question is about the Russian society's role in all of this power structures within Russia. In Lithuania, we have this constant debate about what should be our sort of a position and posture towards democratic Russia, towards whether we should open up very, very openly towards the Russian opposition. I wouldn't say that we have a good, proper agreement in our political elite and both in Lithuanian society. What would be your view on on whether there is hope indeed in Russia, in that Russian society which are still in Russia, who haven't emigrated to the Western countries and whatever other countries. So generally, what are the Russian society's role and view on the things that are going inside Russia, and of course on the war in Ukraine?
Well, if you ask the first question, which is always, what's Putin's poll rating?
Yeah.
You see that it remains very high. I'm not sure that tells you much, because if you're having dinner with your family in Rostov and somebody calls you and says, "You for Putin?" you say, "Yeah, da." I'm not sure what that tells you.
Yeah.
The deeper problem is the society is relatively passive. The society is relatively inert and it is unorganized. You compare it to Ukraine, where the civil society in many ways is the core of the resilience to the war, led by younger people who want to be part of Europe and NATO. We know that. We know all that stuff. But it is the case, and it's some grounds for hope, that Russian opposition groups will eventually put pressure on the elite to change and more open up the country, pursue more democratic policies. We will have to see. But that means I do think we should support them, and I think very strongly support them. We should also continue to value, I think it's immense value, of ways of getting information into Russia. I worked for many years for Radio Free Europe. It doesn't have to be that way, but they do a very good job. So opening up the society can come in a number of ways. However, we have to be careful. Again, maybe it's my fault. 1991 has coursed through my brain a lot, and we misinterpreted the events, as I said earlier. I think we also misinterpreted some of the players at the time. And while there are many excellent Russian opposition groups, and I think we should be engaged with them, we have to be careful, because they are already showing some of the problems that the 91 anti-Soviet groups did, particularly with regard to organizing themselves. No single leader has emerged, and even Navalny, when he was alive, was criticized. So there are a lot of things going on and ebbing and flowing in a generally healthy thing, but you have to be very careful. When I talk to them, they disagree on Crimea, whether it's Russia, and they disagree sometimes on the war. You have to be very, very careful. When you watch Lithuania in those critical years in 89, 90, and 91, when you watched Lithuania, the opposition, the democratic opposition, and there was no doubt it was democratic, was pretty organized and had emerging leaders who led that push to get the Soviets out of this great country. But we have to be very, very careful now, because saying you're a Democrat or anti-Russian, anti-Kremlin is not the same as doing it. And I think we're a long way from having them meet the success that they want. But they could have an effect on making a more milder regime by exerting the pressure. They could, as we saw with the Mothers Against the War in Afghanistan, pressure on individual issues. We saw demonstrations 6 years ago about the pension reductions. So there are opportunities for mass movement, but I think we have to be very careful not to overemphasize their importance at the moment. And we have to be very careful not to assume they all agree with Russia's democratic future transformation as we would want it, or Russia's role in international security as we would want it, a more benign player. We just don't know, but it's worth supporting anyway, just to help them move along and help them achieve what's ultimately a goal, which is to change this horrible system.
The final point of my question refers to the paper that you are now that you will publish soon, as I understand, about the how to negotiate with Russia. Of course, there are talks about possible future negotiations with Russia, whatever United States administration will be in charge in this November. But my question is not about the not about the content of negotiations, but more about the technical aspect, if I may.
Technical parts of negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily technical, but about the modus operandi of the negotiation. How to properly negotiate with Russian diplomats. What needs to be known about how to negotiate? How Russia uses their strength and its opponents' weaknesses.
Very good question.
Yes, please.
And my co-author, Yulia Osmolovska, a prominent and brilliant Ukrainian former diplomat at a think tank in Kiev, and I wrote this, and essentially we argue that Russia's negotiating posture behavior is not like ours, that in order to understand it and get success, you have to understand how they play, and they play by very different rules. So number one, as we argue, and I think obviously correctly, that we think correctly, that Russia's negotiating behavior has a direct relationship to its view of the world, which is a highly competitive, often brutal place where Russia should have a special role, where foreigners can't always be trusted. And you'll see the paper, and you have seen the paper, and that's part one. Part two is that this is reflected in how they sit at the table and behave in terms of getting what they want. Insulting sometimes, contradictory sometimes, saying one thing and meaning another. And if you read the comments of somebody like Andrei Gromyko, a famous Russian Soviet foreign minister, they talk about this. Negotiations are an extension of war or extension of competition. We don't think there's a Harvard School of Negotiations. We don't believe in everybody wins. We don't believe in good. The Russians believe that they want to win and they want you to lose. Why should we care about this stuff? Because they behave this way constantly in Syria and other places in the early stages of a lot of controversies. They behave this way constantly. It reflects a trained Russian attitude to negotiations, which is very different than what we understand in the United States. There is a so-called Kremlin school, which by legend teaches this stuff to emerging diplomats based on experience by the NKVD in the 1930s and so forth. And I think this so-called Kremlin school has to be understood when you're sitting down at the table on whatever the issue might be, let's say strategic arms, and they behave certain ways. You cannot have a successful negotiations, I think, without understanding their patterns of behavior and understanding how different it is from ours.
And do you think that the West generally still have a competence in negotiating with Russia and the
comfortable
competence? Does the West?
Oh, many are. I think I was lucky to be as a young man in negotiations that worked very successfully. But people like Reagan and Thatcher, they knew the system, they knew the adversary, they knew what they wanted, and were prepared to be tough when they thought it appropriate and accommodating when they thought it appropriate. It's Reagan who said, "Trust but verify." And I think one of the experiences of this whole horrible war in Ukraine has been that your country, my country, have learned really how the Russians behave, how to interpret what they say. And that's probably a good lesson to have drawn in this horrible, horrible situation. So yeah, we can be competent, but we can't be naive. And those are key differences. That's a key difference.
Yeah. Donald Jensen, thank you for coming to our program. I just want to remind our listeners that you've been listening to the Right Mind podcast, a podcast produced by the Institute of European Rights. And today we've talked with Dr. Donald Jensen, who is a senior advisor for Russia and Europe at the United States Institute of Peace. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.